With the remains of the previous ship forming a belt around the Arctis Minor, Peregrine and Jay got to work dismantling them. They would put some of the resources gained towards building a second nuclear reactor. With the new spinal rail cannon gobbling up so much power, it helped them to keep the supplies higher during combat, allowing them to keep firing even during prolonged fights. Although Freedom's Hold was doing a good job of either befriending or terrifying the neighbouring factions into leaving them alone, the mechanoids seemed to be undeterred and tried launching another raid against the settlement. Although the raid was of a considerable size, it was once again composed almost entirely of short-range mechanoids, so the squad weren't too concerned. Unfortunately, just as the squad were taking up their positions, a group of visiting traders decided they simply had to leave the settlement right now and walk straight through the oncoming mechanoids, getting sandwiched between them and the hail of bullets from the squad. Annoyingly, the majority of the damage from the attack came in the form of one of the hospital walls being taken out, not by a mechanoid, but by one of the visiting traders, who had seemingly rigged his belt to explode upon his death. A strange concept that, in a world of gunfights, seems more likely to kill your friends than your attackers. Even with the damage, the squad were becoming a dab hand at handling these things, and were cleaning up the bodies, redigging the trenches, and rebuilding the walls within moments of the fight being over. There was a minor risk, however, of the Hold gaining a bad reputation as a safe destination for traders, as yet another group found themselves under fire from the nearby mech cluster. Perhaps they would have to be more proactive in clearing out the dangers in the area. Along with the mechanoids, the squad's reliance on deep drills to provide them with resources was being poorly received by the planet's insectoids, who made regular appearances just to voice their grievances with the situation. The insectoids typically failed to put up too difficult a fight, but they did require the squad to take action to deal with them, pulling people away from their other tasks for the day. In the interests of minimising the negative impact to their work, the commander decided to expand his mechanoid defence force, with an additional Lancer, which of course meant another trip to the softcore subscanner for Tavi. With the Arctis Minor's design beginning to be finalised, Jay felt more confident slapping a coat of paint across her, so he began planning this out. It would take them a long time to grow all of the required dye pigments in the artificial ecosystems, so they'd be best getting started as soon as they can. Dismantling small ship engines from wreckages usually yielded a fair volume of chem fuel. Now that the Arctis Minor no longer utilised chem fuel for its engines, having a lot of it laying around was simply just a fire hazard, so Peregrine decided that it should also be ferried down to the settlement, along with any corpses or steel slag chunks. With just a few chunks from the wreckage of the previous fight, they were able to construct the new reactor in the Naval. The Red Boulder settlement contacted Gardner to ask him to deal with a pack of 20 manhunting Genixes, which he happily accepted. He had no idea what a Genix was, but if he could get some quality weapons and some uranium in return for dealing with them, he was sure he could manage it. The Genixes arrived soon after, allowing the commander to see that they were some weird hybrid between a snow leopard and a lynx. Looking up some info on them from local sources, it appeared that they also reduced the temperature in the air around them, so were domesticated by some tribes in order to refrigerate rooms for them. Domestication wasn't exactly what Gardner had in mind for this pack though. The Arctis Minor's increasing size and subsequently increased heat signature was making it easier for other ships to target it, and it seemed that the majority of ships this far out into the system were more interested in piracy than they were in peaceful trading. The Arctis Minor's power lay in long-range attacks, but with wreckage all around it, they couldn't fire up the engines for fear of accelerating directly into a large chunk of the wreckage. This would mean that the attacking ship could control the distance of the engagement, allowing it to get close enough to utilise its closer range weapons like its plasma cannons and laser turrets. Although it was a waste of resources, the ability to control the distance of the fight was too great an advantage to give up, so Jay reversed the tractor beam of the salvage bay and used it to push the remaining wreckages out of the way of the Arctis Minor, allowing them to fire up the engines. The second volley from the spinal cannon manages to pierce the hull of the attacking ship, taking out a grouping of their weapons. Albeit weapons which weren't in range yet, but all damage was a win. As was becoming frustratingly common, the pirates decided to launch a number of single-person boarding vessels towards the Arctis Minor, which could cause them issues. The laser turrets were on cooldown after shooting down a number of torpedoes, so the boarding vessels were able to slip in close to the Arctis Minor. The third volley from the spinal cannon did significantly more damage, eating away towards the centre of the pirate ship, even taking out one of the torpedo tubes in the process. Despite now having 3 engines, the flight crew hadn't had a lot of time to fuel the engines, and with this fight becoming increasingly long and drawn out, the engines were beginning to run out until only one was left. With only a single engine firing, the Arctis Minor couldn't hope to outrun the attackers, and they were able to get close enough to use all of their weapons. Luckily, the Arctis Minor had already taken out a number of the pirate ship's closer range weapons, otherwise this could have spelt trouble. Peregrine managed to weave the fourth volley from the spinal cannon directly into the cavernous opening they'd already made, punching straight through the shield and destroying the pirate ship's control console, finally putting it out of commission. With that dealt with, Jay and Peregrine just needed to clean up the boarding party. Much to the flight crew's advantage, the boarding party were scattered and disorganised, allowing Jay and Peregrine to pick them off one by one. 4 of them had landed, and Jay and Peregrine took out the first 3 with surprising efficiency, with one of the flight crew always engaging the attackers in hand-to-hand combat so that they couldn't utilise their gun, whilst the other stood back firing shots off at them. The 4th pirate had found themselves in the unfortunate position of getting stuck in between the armoured plating and the hull of the ship. The flight crew could have dismantled a section of the armour or the hull to get to him, but they decided to just let nature take its course and wait for the pirate to starve to death instead. In the meantime, they dragged over a section of wreckage from the pirate ship, and swiftly dealt with the poor pirate they had dragged along with it. With the other segment of the wreckage still heavily inhabited, the flight crew didn't want to drag it over, as they didn't feel confident taking on all of the survivors at once. Not wanting to waste the valuable resources, however, Peregrine made a suggestion. He hopped in the shuttle and flew a short distance away from the wreckage, giving the survivors an unmissable opportunity for revenge. Inching closer to entice them to take their revenge, he waits until they've seemingly all left the wreckage, and then sends a message to Jay back at the Arctis Minor, telling him to activate the tractor beam. Just as the pirates leave the remains of their ship, those remains begin to move away from them, but they realise what's happening only too late. With the wreckage on the move, Peregrine hops back in the shuttle before the survivors can get in range, and flies back to the safety of the Arctis Minor, securing the wreckage without any real risk. It wasn't long before Freedom's Hold saw its next bout of illness, with the flu doing the rounds again. With everyone's missing kidneys replaced and the state-of-the-art hospital, there was no real concern amongst the group of a repeat of the snap situation, but it was important not to be too complacent. Seemingly hearing that some of the group were sick, a group of Neanderthals took the opportunity to attack the settlement. The ground crew had assumed that they would be fine given the poor equipment of the Neanderthals and the existence of Freedom Hold's defences, but the Neanderthals actually bypassed the defences and knocked a hole in the outer walls to get into the back of the base. Between the ground crew and the mechanoids, they were able to shred through the Neanderthals with only minor difficulty. That minor difficulty being that the squad blasted a bunch of their own solar panels in the process. Brom had never been overly pleased with that section of the settlement's layout, however, as the path between the buildings and the solar panels was very narrow, so she took it as an opportunity to clear out the solar panels, move the water pump, and expand the path, to help beautify the settlement. They had a good power supply with the geothermal plants, so wouldn't miss the solar panels, although they could be rebuilt elsewhere if needed. Another pirate ship approached the Arctis Minor whilst they were midway through dismantling the wreckages. Not wanting to abandon the wreckages and all the materials that they promised, the fleet crew braced themselves for another fight without being able to fire the engines. Thankfully, upon scanning the Arctis Minor, the pirates seemed to immediately decide better of the attack, and fired their engines to escape immediately. Taking note of the news from the settlement regarding yet another malaria infection, the flight crew began planning out their next section of the Arctis Minor, a second nacelle to match the first, giving them ample room for a second spinal cannon, a third nuclear reactor, a fourth nuclear engine, and additional heat capacity. With the addition of this room, the Arctis Minor will become a powerhouse, able to punch its way through even high heat capacity shields, whilst tanking any hits and keeping itself at an advantageous distance. Back at Freedom's Hold, the burn pit was still working effectively for the ground crew, although it was often clogged these days with the corpses of the chicks from the infinitely expanding chicken population. They might well have to do something to quell that population soon. The dismantling of the wreckages was progressing slowly, but the flight crew had divvied up the work, with Peregrine dismantling the wreckages whilst Jay took the materials and began building the new extension to the Arctis Minor. Although this meant that it was taking longer to dismantle the wreckages, it also meant there was a good chance that the new hull section would be enclosed before the next attack, offering it extra protection if the shields were to fall. It wasn't long before the mechanoids landed yet another cluster near Freedom's Hold. This one came equipped with a weather changer, which made it harder to ignore as it would continue to cause issues even if they gave it a wide berth. Along with that, the commander's mechanoid defence force was a decent size now, enough so that the ground crew felt confident taking the fight to the cluster. The squad took up positions in a firing line, with the mechanoids ahead of them to draw the attention of the mechs and the turrets. And, once everyone was in place, they began the fight. It was pretty immediate chaos, with the turrets shooting fire into the landscape and a number of mechanoids drop-podding in behind the squad. Thankfully, the squad's equipment and experience allowed them to make quick work of the mechanoids that dropped in behind their line, allowing them to focus their attentions in a single direction. The mechanoid forces consisted largely of pikemen and lancers, which struggled at short range and had a long cooldown on their weapon. This gave the ground crew an advantage, as most of their weapons were rapid fire, allowing them to put a lot of damage into the mechanoids before they could fire too many times. The cluster went quite deep though, meaning that the fight was a drawn out affair, giving the turrets plenty of chances to get shots off at the squad. Thankfully, the majority of the squad were now sporting effective armour, and the mechanoid defence force was helping to tank some of the shots. Nonetheless, by the time the last mechanoids were dealt with, a number of the crew had taken a few minor injuries, and the mechanoid defence force had lost a few members that would need to be resurrected. But they had managed to deal with the cluster, without simply hoping that another attacking force would walk into it and deal with it for them. This was a good sign of their ability to defend themselves, even if there were still improvements to be made. With a few weeks to focus on their work, the flight crew had managed to dismantle all of the wreckages around them and complete work on the second spinal railgun. Unfortunately, just before they could finish up the fourth engine, a small squadron of pirates launched an attack against them. With two of the ships sporting spinal cannons of their own, one plasma and one laser, the flight crew decided to train one of their spinal rail cannons on each. The initial volleys were a huge success, demolishing both of the enemy's spinal cannons. With its three engines, the Arctis Minor was able to dictate the distance of the engagement, meaning that the attacking squadron's only real option was torpedoes, which they didn't have a great number of. With only one ship sporting torpedo tubes, the Arctis Minor turned its attentions to that, and with a single volley from both spinal rail cannons, they knocked it out of the fight. This show of force was enough to send the rest of the squadron into a full-out retreat, leaving the Arctis Minor to retrieve its prize. There were a couple of holdouts on board the wreckage, but they clearly hadn't had the ability to supply all of their crew with EVA suits. So the flight crew took the cautious approach and simply breached each room of the wreckage to ensure that the cold vacuum of space would handle the issue for them. It was around this time that Katsumi and Weaver announced to the squad that they were dating. But whilst the squad were happy for them, it was a bit odd, given that their older sisters were also dating each other. But it served as a reminder to the commander that they would need to recruit some new blood to the rebellion soon. Between his constant breakdowns, Tavi had come up with an idea to improve the settlement's defences. The automated turrets at the entrance had served them well, but they were quite low calibre, limiting how effective they would be against heavily armoured targets, such as advanced mechanoid models. To this end, he had Jay spending his spare time to research how to make high calibre autocannons, and with the help of Brom, he redesigned the entrance to the settlement to incorporate a line of these new autocannons, which would be able to tear through even the toughest of armours. Unfortunately, the new defences weren't quite ready in time for another swarm of blood shrimp that approached the settlement, and with the old turrets dismantled, it meant it'd be down to the squad to handle this one themselves. Although with a single autocannon finished, it was a good opportunity to show off the firepower of the new defences to the rest of the squad. Following the research into autocannons, Jay had taken on a research project he believed would help the Arctis Minor. With the research completed, he began to rearrange the ship's bridge to let them fit in his new invention. It was called a purge port. It was essentially a hyper-insulated chamber which was connected to the ship's heating ducts. The crew could fill the chamber with silver, and when the heat of the ship's systems became too high, they could dump all of the heat into the chamber, causing the silver to become molten. This mass of molten silver would then be ejected out into space, taking a large portion of the ship's heat with it. This would mean that, in the future, as long as they kept the chamber filled with silver, they could release a large portion of the ship's stored heat by simply dropping the shields for a split second, only long enough to allow the molten silver to escape, instead of dropping them for an extended period to try and vent the heat via the heat sinks, allowing them to more safely purge heat from the system mid-combat. It wasn't long before the second nacelle was completed too, sporting another reactor, another engine, 2 large coolant tanks, 2 large heat sinks, and a row of smaller heat sinks. They also added a large capacitor to either nacelle, to store more energy and allow them to enter fights with a bigger store to power their cannons, reducing the chances of them needing to force their reactors into overdrive. With that completed, there was only one section of the Arctis Minor left to build before it would achieve its final form. Jay began planning out a connecting walkway between the 2 nacelles. As well as giving them a little extra space for more coolant tanks and the like, the primary purpose of this expansion was actually to offer more protection to the engines in the centre of the ship. The 2 engines on the nacelles would still be quite exposed, but this way they could at least ensure the functioning of the 2 in the middle, meaning that they were unlikely to find themselves in a position where they had no mobility at all. With the Arctis Minor nearing completion, Gardner asked Vin to join Jay and Peregrine on board, to help speed up the construction of the final section, and to ensure the final preparations were complete for its maiden mission. Peregrine popped down to the planet to pick her up and take her back into orbit. With Vin helping out, they made quick work on the bridge between the 2 nacelles. In fact, within just a few short days, it was essentially complete. Eager to protect it as best they could, the flight crew also opted to add some extra steel plating to it. They also began to plan out what else it could hold, and decided upon 2 more large coolant tanks and 2 more large heat sinks, as well as an extra railgun or 2. With another pirate fleet approaching, the crew wasted no time in taking up their battle positions. With Vin on board, her superior shooting ability meant she was best placed on the tactical console, while Jay manned the control console and Peregrine was stationed near the shield generator, so that he could extinguish any fires and perform any repairs to the generator that may be necessary during the fight. The two smaller pirate ships represented a threat disproportionate to their size, as each of them featured a large railgun and two torpedo tubes, which would allow for long distance shots. As such, Vin aimed a spinal cannon at each of the smaller ships first, in the hopes of removing them from the fight quickly. The first volley removed one, but the second was protected by the shield of the larger ship, due to its position, although a couple of the shots still managed to cause the remaining small ship shields to overheat. The second volley from the spinal cannons was aimed directly at the larger ship. However, its incredibly high heat capacity meant that the shots only just managed to punch through the shield, and only managed to deal some minimal damage to the nose of the ship. Although the heat build-up in the Arctis Minor had been minimal so far, the large ship was getting closer, due to the lack of fuel in two of the Arctis Minor's engines, and once the pirate ship was close enough to unleash its laser turrets, the Arctis Minor's shields were soon overwhelmed. Just as the shields were overwhelmed, however, the Arctis Minor launched its third volley from the spinal cannons, which, thanks to some magnificent aim from Vin, tore through the small ship and tore straight through the large ship at its narrowest point. Just seconds before it was destroyed, a contingent of shuttles escaped from the large ship's shuttle bay. Only a couple of them made it through the Arctis Minor's point defence turrets, however, and those that did were met with a flight crew who were quite experienced at dealing with boarding parties. With the battle done and the boarding parties cleared out, the flight crew began moving the wreckage over to themselves to start dismantling it. Sadly, although decapitating the larger ship had been necessary to protect themselves, it also meant that the large section that was left was too large to tractor beam towards them, but they were still happy with the scraps they'd managed to get from the other two ships, and the pieces that had been knocked loose from the larger ship. With Peregrine having lost a leg during one of the earlier boarding party attacks which hadn't gone as smoothly, he was slowing things down a bit on the ship. As such, Jay radioed Tertial on the ground, and asked him to make a bionic leg specially for Peregrine, which Tertial got to work on immediately. The ground crew were confident in their new defences now, but they were a little curious to see them in action against squishier, fleshier targets. Thankfully, a group from a nearby faction were only too happy to oblige them. With three larger groups approaching from three different angles, the sample size was good, and the results were outstanding. With almost no input from the defenders at all, the new turrets turned the attackers into a fine red mist, one after another. Freedom's Hold was certainly feeling safer, as long as you were inside it and not approaching it. It wasn't long before another group arrived to put it to the test too. Much to their misfortune, they did actually arrive in drop pods, which could have been used to circumvent the Hold's defences altogether. But I guess their recon had been poor, as they instead dropped outside the perimeter wall and walked in, straight into the range of the new turrets. Realising that they had room for two more large heat sinks instead of the large rail cannons and the bridge between the nacelles, the flight crew swapped them out. The majority of their firepower was now in the spinal cannons, so increasing their ability to handle incoming fire while they waited for the spinal cannons to charge would be more effective than adding a couple of extra small caliber cannons. Somehow, word hadn't yet spread to the local factions of the Hold's defences, as yet another group approached from the front. This one had some potential, as they took out a few of the hospital's walls with some dynamite, but it was already too little too late, as the turrets had massacred enough of the TNT wielding attackers' friends that he saw the direction things were going and decided to run. With most of the wreckage dismantled and the ship in a good position, Ben ventured back down to the surface to spend some time with Samini. She would need to return to orbit with the entanglement manifold to let them build the FTL drive, but that could wait for a little while. The flight crew needed to spend a week or so creating enough uranium fuel cells to ensure that both their engines and their reactors were fully stocked before a mission could take place, so Vin could rest for a little in the meantime. Continuing the trend of people not learning their lessons, it wasn't long before another pirate ship attacked the Arctis Minor. But, now in its final form, the Arctis Minor had nothing to worry about from these pirates, and with just 2 volleys of its spinal cannons, made a craterous hole in the centre of the ship, handing the flight crew a quick victory. With the Arctis Minor almost ready, Kelsier began preparing packaged survival meals in the kitchen of Freedom's hold, to send up to the starship so that it could be crewed by more people without them having to worry about supplying their own food. With the structure of the ship completed, all that remained was for them to build the Johnson-Tanaka drive to allow them to achieve faster than light travel, letting them zip across the galaxy to hit Imperial targets, before jumping back across the galaxy before the Empire could even register what had happened to them. Given the rarity and lack of stability of the entanglement manifold, the Johnson-Tanaka drive would also be sequestered within the hull of the ship, to offer extra protection. With the fuel supplies looking healthy, and Peregrine's new leg almost ready, Vin had the squad help her load the shuttle with the entanglement manifold, a bunch of silver for the purge port, and some of the dye that the ground crew had been growing, so that the flight crew could finish painting the Arctis Minor. Once it was all loaded, she headed back into orbit. Speaking of his new leg, Peregrine was soon ready to head back down to the surface for his operation. As was their way, he wouldn't be heading to the surface alone however, as the flight crew loaded up a bunch of the corpses they'd collected from boarding parties and sent them down to the hold along with them, so that they could be dealt with in the burn pit. Once he touched down, Dr. Terciel wasted no time in seeing to him, getting his new leg implanted in no time. And once the sedatives had worn off, Peregrine was straight back in the shuttle, heading back to the Arctis Minor. He felt more comfortable in space after all the time he'd spent there, and had begun to find the blue of the planet's sky quite oppressive. It wasn't long before an interesting opponent came across the Arctis Minor. It was an old Scorpion-class cruiser, a ship which used to be part of the Imperial fleet a number of decades ago. This one, however, had clearly fallen into the hands of pirates, or perhaps deserters. Either way, they'd chosen piracy as their new trade, and the flight crew saw this as a great opportunity to test their capabilities against a class of ship that might still be found in the Imperial Armada. The first volley from the Arctis Minor was able to collapse the ship's shields, but it seemed as though they must have also had a purge port, as the Arctis Minor's sensors indicated that the Scorpion very rapidly vented the heat that was built up. Unfortunately, the first volley had done almost no actual damage to the hull, but thankfully the Arctis Minor's engines could out-accelerate the many smaller engines of the hulking Scorpion craft, allowing them to keep out of range of its two spinal plasma cannons. With a boarding party approaching via shuttle, Vin tactically shut down a couple of the Arctis Minor's laser turrets. This meant that a few extra missiles hit the shields, but the shields could take it. It also meant that as the shuttle reached the range of the lasers, she was able to flip the laser turrets back on, immediately blasting the incoming shuttle, causing it to flee back towards the Scorpion. The second volley from the Arctis Minor took down the shields once more, and this time managed to take out two of its smaller laser turrets as well. More importantly, however, it seems that the pirates had no more silver for their purge port, as they were reduced to venting the heat slowly through the heat sinks instead. With the Scorpion unable to get close enough to pose a real threat, and unable to vent the heat from their system before the next volley from the Arctis Minor, the third volley was the final one, easily breaking through the already damaged shield and tearing directly into the centre of the Scorpion, taking out its bridge. Now they knew for sure they could give the Empire a run for its money. Back at Freedom's hold, the Mechanoids were still trying their best, bless them, but their best was just woefully inadequate. Landing another cluster to the north of the settlement, along with a defoliator, they seemed menacing, but the reality was that the defoliator was far enough away that it was unlikely to cause the rebels any real issues. Still, in the interests of minimising the risks, Tavi hopped on one of the group's salvaged mortar placements and launched a single shell at the cluster. It did little damage, but it did have the desired effect of enticing the Mechanoids into attacking the settlement, allowing the crew to dismantle the Mechanoids with the aid of their ridiculous autocannon turrets. Given the complex nature of the drive, it took a few days, but eventually the flight crew had outfitted the Arctis Minor with a Johnson-Tanaka drive, and it was finally ready to begin its real mission. With the ship officially finished, the commander gave the flight crew the command to turn on their long-range communications receiver. They had the ship, now all they needed was a target. In the meantime, the flight crew continued working diligently to ensure that the engines and reactors were all fully fueled. It was a time-consuming task, as Jay crafted the fuel cells at the nose of the ship and Peregrine and Vin hand-delivered them to the rear of the ship, but with all the construction tasks done, they had the time to spare. Back planetside, the group's work to extend the walkways around the hold to better connect it were interrupted by an attack from a group of rabid alpacas. The ground crew didn't expect much difficulty handling the alpacas, so just wanted to get rid of them quickly. In their confused state, however, they seemed to be having difficulty sniffing out the rebels at the defences, so Shiro volunteered to venture forward to try and lure them into the defences. Sadly, this turned out to be a pretty massive mistake on Shiro's part, as she had underestimated the power of the autocannons. A single stray shot hit her in the back, instantly shattering her spine. They managed to clean up the rest of the alpacas and drag Shiro to the hospital. It looks like Tercia would need to get working on a bionic spine if they wanted Shiro back up and helping out anytime soon. With the fields providing more food than the group could store, and the ship completed, the commander had had Jay turn his attentions to researching brewing. He thought that they could switch over some of the fields from food to hop production, and start brewing their own beer. He thought it'd be a nice little addition to their life on the planet, for the squad to be able to enjoy a beer or two at night. And if they ended up with an abundance of it like they had with the food, they could always sell it to raise funds and make allies. Despite it being due to friendly fire, the universe seemed content with the damage that the alpacas had inflicted upon the squad, and decided to send a flood of merklings to try their luck. Although a merkling's bite could spread the plague, the ground crew weren't too concerned, as they had no intention of letting any of them get that close. Thankfully, with Tercia's crafting skills having been so keenly honed ever since their time on the doomed planet, he was able to knock up a new spine for Shiro, and, utilising his great medical proficiency, he had it installed lickety-split. Shiro would be back up and walking in no time. Well, once the anaesthetic wore off at least. And not a moment too soon either, as, just as Shiro was getting back on her feet, the Arctis Minor intercepted a long-range communique from a couple of solar systems over. It was from a ship run by Pathfinders, a group that the commander himself used to be a part of, who were neutral explorers mapping the vast expanse of space. The Pathfinder's message said that they were being harassed by an Imperial ship, as an excuse to demand their cargo. They were requesting help from any other ships in the area. But given that it was an Imperial ship that was harassing them, none were likely to cross them to help the Pathfinders. None except the rebels, that is. With all haste, Vin shuttled down to Freedom's hold, and, along with the commander, Shiro and Samini, they all jumped back into the heavy shuttle and headed back to the Arctis Minor. The commander wasn't going to miss its maiden mission, and the first strike back against the Empire. With the whole crew gathered in the bridge, the commander took a moment to speak to the crew, and in a short, informal ceremony, he announced that Jay, the architect of the Arctis Minor, would now be its captain, and thus, the first captain of the new rebel fleet. It felt only right given all he'd gone through aboard the ship, and that he'd overseen the entire construction of it. The ship was no longer the commander's. He had a greater mission to achieve anyway by leading the rebellion, and he was only too happy to pass the responsibility of the Arctis Minor onto the young man that they'd saved on the doomed planet all those years ago, who had since then fully embraced the rebels' mission. With the ceremony concluded, Captain Jay fired up the FTL drive, and they leapt back into the war. Jay dropped the ship in just a short distance from the Imperial ship, and immediately began locking weapons on them. The Imperial ship in question appeared to be one of the more modern Manta Ray class ships, outfitted with a number of short-range laser weapons and plenty of engines to enable it to get close enough to use them. But this was exactly the kind of fight the Arctis Minor was designed for. To rob them of their only chance in the fight, Jay started by training the spinal cannons on the engines of the Manta Ray, looking to leave it stranded at a distance where its laser weapons would be useless. He miscalculated a little, however, and the blasts instead hit the ship front on, tearing out their spinal laser turret and dealing a blow to the hull. Thanks to its massive engines and lithe design, the Arctis Minor was actually able to outpace the Manta Ray, even with all of its engines still intact. With that, it was a simple matter for the Arctis Minor to keep its distance, and slowly pick apart the Imperial ship. Volley after volley landed in the centre mass of the enemy ship, slowly tearing away sections of it, ensuring that they could see the inevitability of their demise coming. The commander wanted to make sure they had a chance to get out a warning message before they went down. He wanted to give the Empire a reason to feel fear once more. The enemy ship tried to retreat, but that simply wouldn't be allowed to happen. The next two volleys ripped through their remaining engines, leaving them adrift in space, with the crushing inevitability of their fate looming over them. The Arctis Minor took its time, ensuring the utter destruction of the remaining parts of the ship. Whoever came to investigate the fate of the Imperial ship would be left with no doubt that they had a fight on their hands. Hey guys, Tuna here, one last time for this series anyway, just to say a massive thank you to anyone who's followed this series all the way to the end. I am quite proud of how far the story has come since the first few days on that doomed planet all that time ago. I've had a lot of fun putting this story together, and I hope you've had a lot of fun too, following the squad's escapades through space. This is the end of this story, at least for the time being, but I shall be putting out new series in the near future, so please do be sure to subscribe if you want to see those when they drop. And if you're new here, I do have a small catalogue of previous videos you might enjoy on the channel. With that, we shall bid adieu to the Arctis Minor for now, and I will leave you with a wish that life treats you well. Bye bye!